and final episode in my series on who wrote the Bible. Up to this point, we have covered everything from the Jewish Bible, except for the book of Daniel, as well as everything from the Christian New Testament, except for the book of Revelation. So, in this episode, we are going to complete the series by focusing on these two final books, Daniel and Revelation. There are a couple of reasons why I decided to cover these two books together. First, they both belong to the same genre, that of apocalyptic literature. Second, one of them, Revelation, is heavily influenced by the other one, Daniel. Third, in both cases, they are final books. In the case of Daniel, when it comes to all of the books in the Jewish Bible, it was the one that was written last. And in the case of Revelation, it is the one that comes last in the New Testament. But there's one final reason, and this one is a bit more personal. In a previous video, I mentioned that I grew up in a cult called the Worldwide Church of God. In that video, I discussed one aspect of the cult, its belief in a theory called British Israelism. Well, one aspect of the cult was its belief that the world was about to end. Because of this, the cult focused a lot on the books of Daniel and Revelation, based on the idea that these two books contained important end-time prophecies. So, Daniel and Revelation are kind of favorites of mine, and I'm looking forward to sharing with you how these two books can be understood from a historical point of view, instead of the more sensationalist doomsday view. One of the themes we've seen throughout this series is the fact that sometimes a book in the Bible is set during one period, but is really making a statement about another period. For example, the book of Ruth is set during the period of the Judges, and appears to be about two of King David's ancestors. However, in reality, what it's really talking about is the issue of whether or not Jews should marry non-Jews, something that was a hot topic during the much later Persian period, which is when the book was actually written. This is something we frequently see happen in modern media as well. Take, for example, the 1970s TV show MASH. That show was set during the Korean War, but was obviously an allegory about the later Vietnam War. Well, Daniel is another one of these cases. Although the book is primarily set during the Babylonian period, what it's really talking about is the late Hellenistic period, which was when the Seleucid king, Antiochus IV, was persecuting the Jews. This is something I'd like you to keep in mind as we explore some of its content. But before we do that, I need to explain two terms: prophecy and apocalypse. Both are words that relate to the books of Daniel and Revelation. When people hear the word prophecy, what they usually think of is a prediction about the future. But in ancient Judaism, that's not what prophecy meant. A prophecy was simply a warning. For example, prophets would say, "Look, if you don't change your wicked ways, such and such a bad thing is going to happen. But if you obey God, such and such a good thing is going to happen." In other words, the future was not set in stone. So the main point of prophecy, like other types of religious writings, was simply to convince people to change their behavior in the present. Likewise, when people hear the word apocalypse, they also tend to think about the future, usually an awful future event in which the entire world comes to an end. However, the Greek word apokalypsis simply meant an uncovering of something hidden. So again, apocalyptic literature was more about the present whenever it was written than it was about the future. You see, here's what happened. Initially, the Jewish prophets were like, "See all this bad stuff happening? Well, that's because you sinned. If you shape up, though, things will get better." But unfortunately, things never did get better. The Jews continued to be ruled by foreign powers. First the Babylonians, then the Persians, then the Ptolemies, then the Seleucids. So the prophets decided to take a different tack. What they now said was, see all this bad stuff happening? That's because, on another level, there's a hidden war between good and evil that's happening. But don't worry, hold on tight, because good will eventually win. So, apocalyptic literature was an attempt to uncover and reveal a hidden world. It was an attempt to encourage people and to let them know that God was somehow still in control, even when it seemed that he was not. What apocalyptic literature was not trying to do was to provide an exact blueprint for the future. So now that we know why these books were written, let's see if some of the famous passages from them make more sense. In Daniel chapter 2, King Nebuchadnezzar has a dream in which he sees a statue with a head of gold, arms of silver, thighs of bronze, legs of iron, and feet of part iron, part clay. Growing up, I was taught that this statue was a blueprint for the future, given to Daniel during the Babylonian period. I was told that the head represented Babylon, the arms represented Persia, the thighs represented Greece, and the legs represented Rome, with the 10 toes representing various medieval and modern powers from Europe. The last one being the Antichrist, who was about to appear. However, if we accept the viewpoint that Daniel was actually written by an anonymous author during the Greek period, a different interpretation makes more sense. Instead of describing the future, the author was actually describing the past, up until the time of writing. Understood this way, the head represents Babylon, the arms represent the Medes, the thighs represent Persia, and the 2 legs represent the 2 Greek kingdoms, the Ptolemies and the Seleucids, with the 10 toes representing the 10 Hellenistic rulers that had ruled Judea up until that point. At the end of the dream, a large rock from heaven destroys the statue, and God establishes his own kingdom. What the author of Daniel was hoping for was not some future kingdom, hundreds or thousands of years in the future, but for an independent Judean kingdom to be established in the present. Something that did in fact happen around that time, thanks to the Maccabees. We get a similar prophecy in Daniel chapter 7. This time, Daniel is the one who has the dream. In his dream, he sees a series of 4 creatures rising out of the sea: a lion, a bear, a 4-headed leopard, and an unknown beast with 10 horns. These paintings are actually the ones that were produced by my cult, and therefore I saw them quite a bit as a child. Again, I was taught that they represented 4 kingdoms, and that those 4 kingdoms were Babylon, Persia, Greece, and Rome. Interestingly, it was all this talk about ancient civilizations during my childhood that got me interested in history. Anyway, in the dream, Daniel goes on to see a little horn appear on the 4th beast that has eyes like a man and a mouth that speaks arrogantly. You can see this strange little horn quite clearly in this medieval depiction of the 4th beast. According to my cult, it represented the future Antichrist, who, again, was about to appear any day now. But as you might have guessed, there is another way to understand the dream, one that is based on history as opposed to future predictions. Like with the statue, it's more likely that the 4 beasts were originally meant to represent the Babylonians, the Medes, the Persians, and the Greeks. The Romans weren't depicted because the Roman Empire simply didn't exist yet. As for the little horn, it was almost certainly a reference to Antiochus IV, the Seleucid king who was ruling when the book of Daniel was being written. Finally, I want to address Daniel chapter 9, which is one of the most argued about chapters in the entire Bible. Here we find what's called the 70 weeks prophecy. It's actually a great example of how prophetic ideas were often changed or updated over time. The chapter begins with Daniel reading the words of an earlier prophet, the prophet Jeremiah. And according to Jeremiah, Judah was going to be under the control of Babylon for 70 years. Now, from the perspective of whoever wrote Daniel, those 70 years never really came to an end, because although the Jews were able to return to their land, they remained under the control of foreign powers. First it was Babylon, then Persia, then the Ptolemies, then the Seleucids. So what the author of Daniel decided to do was to put a new spin on Jeremiah's words. Instead of 70 years, it was going to be 70 weeks of years, meaning 70 times 7, or 490. But according to the next few verses, those 490 years would be divided into 3 parts. First, there's a period of 7 weeks. 7 times 7 equals 49. Then there's a period of 62 weeks. 62 times 7 equals 434. Finally, there's one remaining week, which equals 7 years. And according to the book of Daniel, something major was going to happen halfway through that last week. In other words, after 3.5 years. Now, according to most Christians, the 70 weeks prophecy is about Jesus. The most commonly used argument is that the 49 years represents the time between 457 BCE and 408 BCE, which, according to some timelines, is when Ezra was given the go-ahead to rebuild the temple. The 434 years then represents the time between 408 BCE and 26 CE. 26 CE being the approximate date for when Jesus began his ministry. Finally, in the spring of 30 CE, which would have been 3.5 years after Jesus started his ministry, Jesus was killed. Thus, according to Christians, the big event prophesied in Daniel chapter 9 was the death and resurrection of Jesus. Now, I'm not going to flat out say that this interpretation is wrong. If you're a Christian, I understand that seeing certain things in the Jewish Bible as pointing toward Jesus is an important part of your faith. However, I am not a Christian. So for those who might be wondering how Jews view this passage, or how this passage can be understood from a strictly historical point of view, I'm going to give you an alternative interpretation. And again, it all hinges on the realization that the book of Daniel was written in the late Hellenistic period, just prior to the Maccabean revolt, and that the author was building upon an earlier prophecy, the one made by Jeremiah. So let's start there. In Jeremiah 25, verse 1, it says, "The word which came to Jeremiah concerning all the people of Judah, in the 4th year of King Jehoiakim, son of Josiah of Judah, which was the 1st year of King Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon." He then goes on to give a bunch of details, the most important of which is given in verse 11. "This whole land shall be a desolate ruin, and those nations shall serve the king of Babylon 70 years. So this is great because Jeremiah's prophecy begins with some very clear reference points. He says he's speaking in the 4th year of Jehoiakim's reign, which was the 1st year of Nebuchadnezzar's reign, which we know was 605 BCE. So 605 BCE is the starting date for Jeremiah's 70 years, and hence also the starting date for Daniel's 490 years. Let's talk about the 7 weeks first. 49 years after 605 BCE would be 556 BCE. Interestingly, something important did happen around this time. You see, Nebuchadnezzar died in 562 and was succeeded by his son Amel-Marduk. At some point during Amel-Marduk's reign, he released Jehoiakim from prison. Jehoiakim, called the Anointed One in Daniel, was the last independent king of Judah. Jehoiachin's descendants would go on to serve as exilarchs of the Jewish people. Let's now talk about the 62 weeks, or 434 years. Most people assume that the 434 years should come after the 49 years. However, there is nothing in the original Hebrew that requires it to be understood this way. In other words, it could also mean 434 years from the year 605 BCE. This would bring us to the year 171 BCE, which was a very important year indeed. This was the year that the high priest Onias III was executed by Antiochus IV. Onias III was seen as being the last legitimate priest from the original line of high priests. A few years before his execution, Onias had been replaced by his brother Jason, and then by a man named Menelaus, both of whom bribed Antiochus in order to get the position. So this fits with Daniel's description of the Anointed One disappearing around this time. What about the 3.5 years then? Well, approximately 3.5 years after the death of Onias, another major event occurred. In the year 167 BCE, Antiochus IV put a stop to the Jewish sacrifices at the temple, and instead sacrificed a pig to Zeus. For Jews at the time, nothing could be more horrible than that. Here's how Daniel described it. At the corner of the altar will be an appalling abomination. I think it's far more likely that the abomination referred to in Daniel chapter 9 is the thing that Antiochus IV did right around the time that the book of Daniel was written than it is a reference to the death of Jesus. Okay, let's now move on to the book of Revelation. In the first chapter, the author names himself as John and states that he is writing from the island of Patmos, where he has been imprisoned for being a Christian. This allows us to date the book to either the 60s CE or the 90s CE, as these are the first two periods in which Christians were persecuted. First under Emperor Nero, and then second under Emperor Domitian. Most scholars lean toward a date of around 95 CE, making Revelation one of the last books of the New Testament to be written. In addition to this, most scholars feel that the John that wrote Revelation is not the same John that wrote the Gospel of John and the 3 epistles of John. But either way, Revelation was written at least 230 years after the book of Daniel, and a lot had happened in those 230 years. The most notable thing being the rise of the Roman Empire, which went on to conquer the Hellenistic kingdoms, as well as the kingdom of Judea. But another way to look at it is that not much had changed at all. The Jews were still being ruled by a foreign power. It's just that the foreign power was now Rome. This is made clear in Revelation chapter 13, where John describes a beast rising from the sea. He describes this beast as being part lion, part bear, and part leopard, having 7 heads and 10 horns. This is obviously referring back to the 4 beasts from the book of Daniel. But here he combines the 4 beasts into a single creature, basically saying that Rome is the successor to the previous 4 kingdoms, and is as bad as all the previous 4 combined. Again, this image is the exact one that was used by my cult, the Worldwide Church of God, in order to scare people into obedience. According to my cult, the 10 horns represented 10 reincarnations of the Roman Empire, with the final one about to appear any day now, ushering in the end of the world. However, like I said earlier, apocalyptic literature wasn't actually about providing a blueprint for the far future. It was about what was happening in the present. And when John was writing Revelation, the present reality consisted of Rome persecuting Jews and Christians. John was trying to peel back the layers of what was happening to reveal a hidden cosmic battle that he claimed God would eventually win. We can see further evidence for this this in verse 18, where he mentions one of the most famous numbers in the entire Bible, 666. Over the centuries, there have been a lot of theories about the meaning of this number, most of which are just plain crazy. But one theory that does make sense is that the number was a code word for Nero, the first Roman emperor to persecute Christians. If you switch the Greek consonants with Hebrew consonants and add up the numbers associated with each letter, you get 666. Or alternatively, if you switch the Latin consonants with Hebrew consonants, you get 616, which some scholars argue is the more accurate translation of the number. There are two other famous passages from Revelation that I want to address. The first is in chapter 4, where John describes God sitting on his throne. In verse 7, he describes 4 living creatures that sit around the throne. These are different from the 4 creatures we discussed earlier. This time they look like a lion, an ox, a man, and an eagle. And instead of being based on something from the book of Daniel, these creatures are based on a passage from Ezekiel, where they are portrayed as being angels. So this is yet another example of one prophetic book putting a new spin on an older prophetic book. In Christian tradition, the 4 living creatures are usually thought as representing the 4 gospel writers, something that can be seen in lots of Christian artwork throughout the centuries. Remember the stained glass images I used in the Gospels episode? Well, check out the full version of those images. Here you can see that Mark was associated with the lion, Luke with the ox, Matthew with the human, and John with the eagle. Okay, the last thing I want to talk about are the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse. These famous characters show up in Revelation chapter 6. So again, we get a series of 4 creatures, but this time all 4 are horses, but differently colored horses: white, red, black, and pale. And as you might have guessed, differently colored horses do show up in previous prophetic books. They show up in both Ezekiel and Zechariah, and are quite clearly meant to represent punishments sent by God. There have been all kinds of theories about what exactly the 4 horsemen in Revelation represent, with war, famine, and disease being common suggestions. Once again, the imagery has inspired lots of art over the centuries. But as with everything else we've discussed, in my view, the imagery is not about future predictions, but rather about present realities at the time of writing. After all, war, famine, and disease were all things that were present during Roman times. Okay, so that concludes our series